answered, we can move on. So we can end this poll and share the results. So again, very interesting. So appreciating each other's cultures and diplomacy seem to be the two big ones, and thankfully hardly anyone wants war, which is good news. Okay, let's move on to the third question. Which of the following is the biggest obstacle limiting India and China's friendship? Mistrust on territorial claims, unwillingness to initiate the handshake to avoid appearing weak, poor image of China because of expansionism, true friendship exists between equals, and which is not the case here. So as I said, if new people have joined in the last minute or so, you will see a question on your screen. We can have your opinion on this, and the speakers might comment on this during their conversation. Okay, we'll leave this on for another 10 seconds. Most people have answered it already. All right, let's share these results. Very clear. More than half the people think it's because of mistrust on territorial claims on the borders. And hardly anyone thinks it's because we are not equals as countries. I'm sure the speakers will have views on this. Okay, I think most people have joined, so let's have a quick share of one more question. We have time for one more, and then we'll get on with the main event. So here's the last question. Which one is the main reason why India and China are unfriendly? Perceptions of each other, territorial claims and perimeters. Strategic partners tend to be on different sides, and asymmetry of power between the two countries. We leave this for a few seconds. Most of you know what is being done, so this will move fast. Yep, I think most people have answered the questions, so another 5 or 6 seconds. All right, so it's again fairly clear. About half of the people in the audience think it's territorial claims is what's causing the problem. Okay, these were very interesting results and very interesting views from our audience, which I'm sure our speakers will think about and address these during their conversation. Okay, all right, welcome again, everyone. And thank you for participating in these polls, and let's move on. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Some of you have logged in with your device names and so on. Can you please rename yourself? You select your name, right click on it and rename yourself with your real name. So when you ask questions, we'll know who's asking. We will all remain on mute except the speakers so that there is no noise. Of course, that doesn't mean that your opinions are not important. All your opinions are very important. Please keep typing your questions in the chat box. And towards the end of the conversation, we'll pick up as many of those questions as possible, and our speakers will address your questions. So please keep typing questions, and we'll come to those questions very soon. So thank you for those admin steps. Most of our audience has been here before, so this doesn't need any great introduction as a concept. The conversation series is a string of webinars, as most of you know, hosted by Ahmedabad University. We've had an amazing lineup of thought leaders and academics and industry practitioners on this platform on a wide range of topics, from economics to politics to business to technology and so on. And today is no exception. In addition to being hosted by Ahmedabad University, we are happy to announce that today we are also hosted by the newest center in the university, and the Center for Inter-Asian Research. And our colleague, Professor Tejaswini Niranjana, who is the director of this new center, who's also in the conversation today. She will tell you a little more about the center when the conversation starts. So we are really happy that this shiny new center has chosen the conversation series as their first major event to address people on. So today's topic is very important, as you would have seen from the poll questions, or maybe a polarizing topic. China has been a looming presence over India, not only recently, but for centuries. And the relations between India and China have swung widely across the centuries, from extensive exchange in culture, literature, food, religion over many centuries in a very amicable manner, to the current icy tensions over the border skirmishes and so on. So today we thought we'll address this question, and we couldn't have asked for a better set of speakers to talk about it. Our guest speaker and our main speaker today is Professor Kanti Bajpai. Professor Kanti Bajpai is an expert on India's foreign policy, on South Asia and international security. He studied initially at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and then earned his PhD at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Kanti's full list of professional affiliations would take an hour, so I'll not even attempt doing that. He's currently he's been professor at Oxford and at JNU, and he's currently the Wilmar Professor of Asian Studies and Director Center on Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Kanti is also relevant to today's conversation, recently published a book on this topic called India versus China, Why They Are Not Friends. So that book title sums up exactly what we will be talking about today. And as you saw from the poll questions, Professor Kanti Bajpai will be in conversation with Professor Tejaswini Niranjana, who, as I said, is the director of the new Center on Inter-Asian Research, and also the Dean of Online Programs at Ahmedabad University. Tejaswini was previously professor and head of the Department of Cultural Studies at Lingnan University in Hong Kong. And she brings immense experience in understanding cultural intersections between India and China. So with that, I'll get out of the way and leave you in the good hands of our experts. So Tejaswini, over to you.
It's a real pleasure to have had a chance to read this book. Thank you, Kanti, for writing it, and thanks to Ravi for lending the book to me. So yes, it's it was a very, very good read. It was easy in some sense, difficult in others, and I think that we'll spend the next hour trying to figure out what could be these points of contention as well as agreement that we might get at from the very mixed audience we have today. I'm so delighted that I think that some people from my former institution are also here. It's good to have people from both the Chinese side and the Indian side in this chat. I have known Kanti for a very long time, off and on. I have known him last at NUS when I was a fellow there at the Asia Research Institute. And we had to ride to the institute on a bus, and we'd have conversations on the bus. And before that, a long time ago, in different parts of Asia. I've never met him in India, which I think speaks to the condition of Indians in Asia today in some interesting ways. It's so delightful that he's able to be with us online at Ahmedabad University. We hope to be able to host him in person at the Center for Inter-Asian Research somewhere down the line when Singapore's COVID regulations are not as severe as they are. So we welcome you in advance. Hope to see you soon in person. I think that I'm just going to toss out a few questions, maybe one after the other, like I won't do them all at once. And I will see what you would like to speak to. We are hoping this will be more of a book talk because I suspect many people in the audience would not have read the book. So let us take this opportunity to be able to lay out what the key arguments are and what the main points of focus might be. So I think let me begin by asking you, you are an expert in the field. You have spoken at many, many occasions on these topics. You have written many academic books on this. This is more of a trade book for the lay reader. Why did you feel it is important to write this book now, especially in the midst of the pandemic, which you have done?
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Tejaswini and Ahmedabad University and your center for helping organize this. It's lovely to be here. I was saying earlier that I had 3 years teaching at Maharaja Sayaji Rao University in Baroda, and I look on that time with great fondness. Sadly, I never got out to Ahmedabad, but I guess I have got to Ahmedabad virtually thanks to this talk. So I'm very, very happy to do it. I think, you know, the question you posed it around the pandemic. Actually, I guess for someone who does international relations and strategic studies, it really came in the wake of Galwan and the clash up there in which lives were lost, and the roiling debates that had begun before Galwan in India, perhaps in China as well, and then carried on, of course, after the incident. And in the midst of that, Juggernaut Books came to me. So the origins of the book are as prosaic as that, in a sense. I'm a bit of a lazy guy. I think I would probably never have written this book if they hadn't come to me, and if the commissioning editor wasn't a friend of mine who twisted my arm. It so happened that I'd taken a semester off. So those are the kind of very mechanical, almost reasons that this book got written. But the wager that Juggernaut put in front of me was the book had to be written in 3 months. It had to be short, 50,000 words. It's considerably longer, as it turns out. And most of all, it had to appeal to a general audience. And the concern Juggernaut had was exactly what I pointed to, which is, you know, quite a lot of the sort of, I mean, debates is a strong word that broke out in India. There seemed to be a kind of howling that came out of Galwan, especially on television. And I watched some of it myself and was quite taken aback at how misinformed, uninformed, or contentious it was. And a lot of it was just a lot of shouting matches. I think Juggernaut felt that here was a time, and I agreed, where an accessible book, a trade book that appealed to the general reader, and that didn't assume that the general reader knew a lot, but wanted to know quite a lot, obviously, about why India and China were locked after many years of having been at peace. And I think part of the puzzle was, perhaps I'll just finish with that thought, was that as you know, as we were saying earlier on this, India and China have a very, very long history of peace. I mean, we know that there was a bit of a spat during King Harsha's time when a Chinese army came over after some Chinese envoys had been badly treated and I think killed. I mean, we're going back, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years to that event. We know that the Dogra kings in Kashmir and Tibetans fought periodically over the border alignments and things like that. But really, it's a very long history of the two states, as it were, not fighting. We know Indian troops were used in China during the Opium Wars and, you know, in the Boxer Rebellion and so on. So I suppose one could say that's another case where Indians and Chinese didn't look at each other in a very kindly way necessarily. But really, I mean, partly because of geography, perhaps, these two massive societies didn't fight. And so it's quite disturbing and puzzling that in the modern period, let's say particularly from 1949 onwards, the relationship has become contentious. We fought in 1962. And of course, last year, just since I mentioned 1962, again, I mean, to set that in context, it was quite a small war. I mean, it's represented as being fought over 1 month, which is correct at a very formal level, but the actual days of fighting were 11 days out of those 30 days. That's when the two armies actually fought and suffered casualties. And any death is sad, of course, but you know, the numbers of casualties by any kind of standard of modern warfare, very, very small. I mean, there are about 2,000 deaths totally on two sides, and maybe about 2,500 to 3,000 injured. So, you know, I mean, given the size of these two countries, their militaries, and the expanse of the border, This is a very small war, and in much of Chinese parlance, it's called a skirmish. So I think that was a bit of the puzzle that Jagannath put before me, and that I kind of engaged. And last word on this. I had really written in the preceding years on the cooperativeness between India and China. And so I was a bit intrigued to now turn my attention to why they were not friends, why there was contention. And so that's the origins of the book.
Yeah, thanks for laying out the context and for talking about what propelled you to write this, apart from the fact that the publisher wanted you to do it. I think the shifting perception that you talked about is very crucial to how you position the arguments in the book as well. So let me ask you one more question about the layout of the book this time, in terms of the sections and chapters. You have 4 main sections and the conclusion, and they're in a very alliterative way. They're perceptions, perimeters, partnerships, and power. And I find it interesting that perimeters is the longest section of the ball. So there are actually a big question and a small question. Why would you choose to pick these 4 axes on which to talk about this relationship or this unfolding relationship? And why would you think that perimeters is featuring so prominently in this discussion?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I scratch my own head over it. If you think India, China, there's a kind of a very long list of topics that I didn't address, but that were in my initial list that I gave to the publisher. But I think partly just the length of the work, which was supposed to be 50,000 words. And I realized that there was no point trying to engage every single thing between them. Secondly, there would have been no kind of thesis or kind of kind of trend in the book. I mean, it would have just been a set of a list, really. River water issues, the relationship with Pakistan, their rivalry or cooperation in third regions, their trade, ecological issues, climate change. And I thought that, well, given what had happened around Galwan and the origins of the book, and of course also some of the difficulties the two were having over the pandemic as well, that one had to focus on what were some of the key things that were dividing them, as it were. And so the book does say that there have been elements of cooperation. There are many other topical areas that you could bring in. And I suppose Pakistan is the one I've been asked about the most. So people have said, why not a 5th P? Why didn't you have Pakistan in there? And I guess my answer to Pakistan and to these other topics was that, in a way, many of them are more kind of consequence of, in a sense, of the basic rivalry than they are the cause of the basic rivalry. I mean, to take the Pakistan example, Pakistan enters the fray of the bilateral relationship and complicates it and so on. And I guess India and China disagree over Pakistan now, but that wasn't the origins of the problem. In fact, at one point, Pakistan had offered under General Ayub to partner India against China and was turned down rather brusquely by Nehru. So it just seemed to me that, I had to focus on 4 or 5 key areas. And I think just pure induction, having a sort of sense of the materials rather than some grand theoretical kind of take on how conflicts between neighboring countries occur, or IR theories, international relations theories on protracted rivalries between states. I just decided not to go that way. And anytime I thought of doing that, my publisher slapped me around a bit, saying, please, you've got an audience here that doesn't want all that. Get to the heart of it. And so why these 4? I mean, I think they just kind of popped out inductively. And sometimes I explain it by doing an analogy to the individual. And I say that, when 2 people have a relationship, their perceptions of each other, what's this person like? How have we interacted over the years? What image comes up? What is the gestalt of the person when we kind of look at them and deal with them? I think that's very important in our daily lives, and there's lots of social science theories on kind of, so whatever, symbolic interactionism, Goffman's work, and that kind of stuff that sort of speaks to that, I suppose. And then I suppose between 2 people, of course, there's always the issue of property. I mean, I have my stuff and you have your property, and I don't want you coming and claiming my garden and my effects, and you don't want the same. So I think the issue of perimeters, of what's the physical perimeters between us, what is mine and what's yours, and we don't try and take it away from each other, and we're quite sort of third is, what are our relationship to third people? I mean, to other people. And that speaks to this issue of partnerships, which that chapter looks at how India and China relate to the Soviet Union, the United States, and then the Soviet Union successor, Russia. So I think our relationships with significant others, third parties, matter in social and personal life. And I think they matter in the life of nations, I guess, as well. And the last is that inevitably between individuals, there's the play of power. However you think about power. So the fourth chapter, the fourth P, is the relationship of power between these two countries that went from relative symmetry as late as 1980 to this yawning gap that has opened up, at least on some measures. So I think that's one way of just kind of typifying why I ended up with these four.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And it's a very curious and interesting comparison you make with the person or the self and nation states. So I think the questions are already coming, but before that happens, we still have a little while to go. Let me take you back to the perimeters topic, because I was very fascinated by the history you traced in relation to the the issues that people are arguing about. Well, clearly, all of these boundaries are drawn mostly by colonial map makers. And you go on to say that, especially when you talk about the 60s and the Nehruvian era, that there's so many confusions and ambiguities about borders. Also, that the technical expertise in preparing maps was not so readily available on either side. And that you put so much stress on the confusion, the ambiguity, the lack of clarity on maps. And in spite of that, why are borders so important? What is at stake in the borders? Apart from saying this is my property and this is yours, I think there's something larger you're gesturing towards. Would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, at one level, it's again a bit puzzling. If you look at if you ask, what's so significant about these borders? I mean, just the gross square kilometerage is tiny. I mean, even for India, it amounts to something like 2% of the land area of India, or 3%, and even less for China. So at a very gross level, these are tiny slices of land, to be honest. Even Arunachal Pradesh, I mean, it looks very big on a map, but in relation to the rest of India, rest of China, these are very small bits and pieces of real estate. But obviously, I mean, they signify something. There's identity issues clearly that become cathected to these plots of land. And states, we know all over the world, over very small pieces of land, I mean, they invest so much into it. And so I think obviously there's the play of that. And part of that identity obviously is connected to cartography. I mean, I think we've all probably had the experience. I mean, I know I have, when I was taught to draw a map of India in school, just for a freehand, and I can still do it. And it took me years and years into my 20s when I was talking to a Pakistani friend, and I suddenly saw another map of India, which, the crown up there of Kashmir is very different when the Pakistanis look at it and claim it. And I was speechless for a moment, because my entire kind of attachment to India, in a sense, suddenly changed. I mean, I was confronted by this very gross cartographic fact, which was on the ground is actually more the fact than the maps indicate. I think there are strategic issues here, obviously. I mean, there's no point getting away from the fact that China built a road from Xinjiang into Tibet through Aksai Chin, which is the so-called Western sector, at a time when they weren't sure of how much control they had in Tibet. And the main military garrisons at the time were in Xinjiang. They felt they had to move troops and materials into Tibet quicker. They didn't have the fantastic infrastructure they now have from Eastern China. And so, it took on a very strategic a purpose for them to claim Aksai Chin, and so that remains the case, although less the case than it was in those days, because since then there are alternative routes and so on. In the eastern sector, that is what we call the eastern sector, what was Nifa then, Arunachal Pradesh today, and what the Chinese call South Tibet. I mean, there the situation somewhat reversed. Chinese claims are up to the the plains in Arunachal, in the southern slopes of the hills, which means that if the Chinese got that claim, their forces would be right into the plains of Arunachal Pradesh, or that part of northeastern India. And so, of course, it makes India's kind of strategic military picture that much more tenuous then. And so there's a kind of Indian strategic case for keeping the Chinese at least on the crest of the mountains rather than down on the slopes. So both have some kind of a strategic argument as well for these, even though the slices of land are relatively small in the larger scheme of things. So I think that, that's kind of three very bold reasons why the perimeter chapter is so big, and it matters. I mean, partly the chapter is so big because there's so much empirical material on the perimeters as well. So, and to write a book on India, China without talking about the border issue, as as you saw in your poll, would be a bit eccentric, and so, and there've been negotiations over 40 years, almost without interruptions on it. So it merited a lot of attention. I think the interesting thing is what you raise, which is that how come, with all their best efforts, and they both tried to negotiate in the early days, and since then, for 40 years, from 1981 to 2021 almost, without a single year, which is an exception, they've tried to negotiate in different forums and in different ways, and they haven't solved the problem. And this at a time when China has solved many of its problems in borderlands, and India has solved various problems as well. So here are 6 or 7 reasons I think that it didn't work out. And I think the formative period is quite instructive. I mean, maps were certainly part of the problem. India inherited maps, the Chinese had their maps, but in the chaos and of partition, civil war, it seems to me that one of the things that was difficult was bringing all the kind of cartographic materials quickly together. And both leaderships wanted to get to the negotiations eventually, but they weren't very confident, and their bureaucracies were not confident that they could access all the maps. I mean, it wasn't until 1960, to give you an example, that S. Gopal, the historian, finally came back from London and was really thoroughly able to brief Nehru on his research on particularly the Aksai Chin area. So until 1960, it's instructive that Nehru sometimes said there's nothing to discuss on Aksai Chin, and other times he said, oh, I'm not sure. The Chinese also, I mean, they had a group of cartographers in Tibet who very quickly in the 50s said, no, we're very sure of our claims and we should start opening up the discussions with the Indians. On the other hand, there's evidence that Mao and Zhou Enlai said, maybe not, for other reasons, which I'll come to. But, they were not convinced that it was the appropriate time. Likewise, on the Indian side, as I've said, they weren't very sure cartographically, but there was a counterpart of the Chinese school. There was a sooner school and a later school. So the sooner school included my grandfather, Girja Bajpai, who was head of the Foreign Service at the time, and KPS Menon, who were arguing to engage the Chinese on the border issue with a view to factoring in Tibet. Said, okay, if we will recognize China's control over Tibet, they should recognize, our claims on the border. But on the other side, on the Indian side was K.M. Panikkar, the historian, who was ambassador in Beijing, and Nehru dithering, but more inclined to Panikkar, who was part of the later school, they were prone not to, push the border issue, thinking that India had not consolidated its administrative hold in the borderlands, and it would be folly to engage the issue. So what happened essentially was that on both sides, apart from the simple cartographic issue, there was a strategic divide within their community of decision makers between a sooner school and a later school. And so some of the kind of ambiguities and inconsistencies that showed up in their talks at the bilateral level, it seems to me were not bad faith. You know, the general story is that they both set out to deceive each other. And particularly on the Indian side, you hear that, the Chinese said this, but actually they did something else. But you can, in a thought experiment and with some evidence, you can show the Chinese would have a case for making, exactly the same argument. Sometimes Nehru was very strong in Aksai Chin, other times he was not. Sometimes Zhou Enlai seemed to suggest that we could do a deal, the two sides, where more or less Arunachal Pradesh would go to India and China would really get its way on Aksai Chin. Other times he seemed to not be so sure that that's what he'd said. And he poo-pooed the idea that he ever said it. So both thought that they were trying to be deceptive, but actually there were reasons why they were not altogether certain. Cartographic, internal political. I mean, we've got to remember that India had come out of partition. It had many other things to think about. It had come out of World War II. It had just become free. It was trying to set up a political system and consolidate itself. The Chinese had come out of a world war. By the way, the World War II for China started earlier than for India. It started in 1937 with the Japanese invasion, and it was a brutal war. The Chinese lost more people than any other country except Russia in the war. And there was a civil war at the same time. So they came out of that. The Communist Party was trying to consolidate rule and so on, integrate Tibet and places like that. In 1950, they were fighting the Americans in Korea for 4 years. So, they had other distractions. Both were dealing with the Cold War, not just each other. And then there's the issue of they had different political cultures. And maybe I'll just stop here. What I mean by that is that it's quite instructive that Nehru went on about, the Indian side, about we've got to solve this forensically, legally. Let's look at some basic principles for delineating borderlines. The crest of the mountains, well-accepted principle, norms and practices going back historically, which were embedded in treaties. Let's honor treaties. Let's not ever disturb colonially received treaties, because if you do, then all over the world, there'll be chaos because so many colonies were becoming free after, partitions by the colonials. So they took that kind of view. But Mao and Zhou Enlai, these were revolutionaries. And they'd fought war. They were strategic minded and very political minded. So they were of a mind to cut deals, to follow through strategically, to weigh up costs and benefits, and where is the main enmity that you're dealing with. And if you had to cut a deal with one side to deal with another enemy that was more threatening, then you did that. Forget about where the legality took you or the old treaties took you. So, I think they were simply coming at it from a different kind of political culture and strategic culture. And so I think this is why a lot of those early years, they were prone to just talking past each other completely. So I guess I don't take the view that, as some do, that it was all bad faith. The Chinese were from the beginning determined to beat Nehru up and beat India up and get their way. I don't take the view that Nehru was just some dithering old fool who just didn't know what he was about, and he was innocent about China, and that he was grasping at territory to kind of deal with the Chinese and put one over them either. I think the story is probably more like the one I just tried to sketch in.
So many questions spring to mind. I don't even know where to begin. But I just want to throw in one additional factor for what you saw as both the sooner and the later, especially the later faction, if you like, on both sides. The idea that, both of these, at that point, nation states that become nation states, right, which they weren't before, were actually dealing with forming alliances in Cold War times with other like-minded countries. And in that particular alignment, there is Bandung, Third World, whatever, in that alignment, they were likely to be on the same side. And maybe that could be one of the reasons why they didn't want to get into a protracted border warfare or any serious warfare anytime down the line, right? So I just wondered if that was also there it's not just a strategic or a military or a political decision, but also a larger sense of the alignments and changing nature of, alliances against the big powers. So I wondered if that would be a factor.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's true. I mean, one way of answering it is that certainly, I mean, I know more about the Indian side here, but I mean, go back to Nehruvian internationalism for one thing, a general sense of kind of solidarity with other countries, particularly those who had just come out of colonialism. I mean, China was not formally a colony, but it had come out of the 100 years of humiliation and so on. There were territorial enclaves where colonial powers held sway. And then more positively, there was the promise of kind of, as you say, Asian solidarity with Bandung and so on. So I think, for Nehru and on the Indian side, yeah, I mean, they certainly valued that. I don't think we can be cynical about it, as some people are. On the Chinese side, I think, they had their form of internationalism as well, which was Marxism, Maoism. I mean, it was a revolutionary internationalism, but I think there was quite a serious sense in which the emancipation of people all over the world from capitalism and so on, from feudalism, this was important. And in that sense, there was a larger struggle, and, borders and territories and fighting wars over it seemed somewhat inappropriate, when there was this much larger kind of emancipatory struggle that perhaps confronted both sides. I don't want to exaggerate both these internationalisms, but I think after all, these were political people, and they both fought kind of nationalist struggles. And they always knew that those national struggles were embedded in a much larger world kind of structure, where there were very other important actors. And then these Cold War dynamics immediately threatened to kind of do away with that vision of emancipation and freedom and so on that both were trying to celebrate, and in their different ways. And I think, I mean, Nehru didn't really like communist ways very much, for sure, although he's attracted to socialism and all of that. And Mao thought that often that, and for a long time, that Nehru was just some rather odd little bourgeois leader with no very interesting progressive thoughts. But still, I mean, they themselves held to some kind of progressive, socialist, emancipatory, revolutionary view of the world. And yet, there was this Cold War sucking them into alliances. Having said that, I mean, the partnership chapter, the third P, does show, I mean, they had agency, and they chose to, for their own reasons, to go along with these partnerships. And I mean, the Chinese very quickly partnered the Soviets against the Americans, although there were always tensions with Moscow. And India, implicitly, because it was formally non-aligned, I mean, it did tilt towards and count on the Anglo-American powers for protection against China. So here there's a bit of an asymmetry. I think throughout this period, right up to now, the Chinese have not allied against another great power, that is the Americans, the Russians, the Soviets, against India, because they haven't really needed to. They felt themselves powerful enough to deal with India on their own. But India has always, non-alignment notwithstanding, always partnered someone against China. It partnered the Americans briefly, very ostensibly during the 1962 war, but Nehru always counted on the Anglo-Americans to help him out if there was trouble with China. And of course, later, when the Americans particularly had their opening to China in 1971, India swung more and more towards the Soviets. I mean, there were other reasons why India did that, but China was certainly on Indira Gandhi's mind as well. So, and subsequently for Indian prime ministers. So you're right that, I mean, there was the Cold War pulling them into sometimes opposite directions, but they also chose partners on opposite directions. And one of the things the book says is that they've had partnerships, but they've never partnered each other. They've never, I mean, I say they've briefly been kind of aunt-like partners against the Americans. In the early years, until about mid-1950s, one can see that India and China both were worried about a rampant America. I mean, America was the biggest power at that time, and they didn't like a kind of neo-imperialism of the Americans. And then after the Cold War, when America again was so triumphal, there was a period of about 5 or 6 or 7 years, or a bit longer, when China and India saw more eye to eye and were worried about, you know, a unipolar world with America at the top. But other than that, they've never been allies, except, you know, during the Second World War against the Japanese, where British Indian troops obviously fought the Japanese. India was a base of operations for allied help to the Kuomintang against the Japanese. But otherwise, these are two countries that have never been allies. India has been allies with the Soviets, with the Russians, with the Americans, and so the Chinese with those two powers, but they've never actually been together. And what that means at one level is that their highest level decision makers, military and civilian and political, have never been so, well, kind of lips and teeth, if I could use the expression, that, you know, that they have, that they know each other and trust each other deeply on strategic matters.
Yeah. This is, you know, obviously a set of propositions you have about the nation states that are today India and China. And although you sort of gestured towards a very long history where you said these nations were at peace, they were not even nations then. They were territories, regions, sort of empires. And I think the form of the nation state is very much a post-Second World War form that everyone is forced into. So I wonder if one would have to treat that history differently and mark more clearly when India and China emerge as nation states, because many of the preoccupations that you talk about with borders, with you know, racisms of both, you know, on both sides, etc., seem to be of more recent vintage, and therefore also embedded in this sort of Cold War politics, where you have other players, bigger players even than India and China, who are geopolitically speaking stronger, who are, you know, also infusing their ambitions and their own racisms into this particular discourse. So we end up then, you know, Orientalizing China just as China Orientalizes India. And this is really not a structure of perception that is historically valid in the region at all. So I'm very curious about how not nation states like Beijing talking to Delhi, Delhi talking to Beijing, most of your narrative is about that. What does it mean for human beings living in these territories to experience each other? You have a section in the beginning of your book where you talk about, you're quoting a journalist talking about the kinds of incidents of racism against Indians that she faced when she was in China. Curiously, I mean, I've been traveling to China for the last 20 years and on different occasions, and maybe I'm protected as an academic, but, you know, I've also been on the streets, not as an academic. My experience has been completely the opposite of whatever this journalist was. The curiosity, openness, willingness to learn, wanting to learn, all kinds of questions about, you know, where India is, what India could be. Of course, misconceptions, but dealt with in a very gentle way, you know. And for example, when I've taken, you know, musical collaborators to China, when we have had large audiences, really large audiences, full of curiosity, asking questions about everything, and very receptive, very open. This does not come across when one reads your book. So what happens to the human experience on both sides and the experience of ordinary citizens who are not speaking through Beijing and Delhi, but just finding other ways of connecting with one another? How would this maybe change the picture? Would it change the picture?
Yeah, I mean, to my mind, it's mixed. I mean, I think, like you, I've never had an episode in all my trips to China, which I would describe as negative, you know. And so there is that existential kind of, you know, reality as well. I mean, there's a sort of palimpsest. There's the strategic nation state kind of part of it. And then underneath that, there's some other story also that exists. I mean, the book in a way doesn't really deal with it because it's a strategic book that is about strategic issues mostly. But that perceptions chapter, the first one, I mean, does try to tell another story of two societies historically, and, you know, a period at least until 1000 of the Christian era, when travelers and monks and learned people and traders and perhaps even adventurers moved across what today we call boundaries, which in those days I don't think would have been described as boundaries really. And they went for completely different reasons to each other's lands. And in a sense, the counterparts exist even now of pilgrims. And they're pilgrimages for different reasons now. They may be economic reasons, to learn more about each other and know each other's wisdom and so on. There are traders even now. There are kind of intellectual and other adventurers who go to study or to just to travel and experience something very different. That's a form of adventure. I mean, to know something radically different and engage it and be shocked by it, attracted to it, discombobulated by it, that's an adventure. It's a cultural adventure. And I think there are people like that, obviously, even now. So I think there is that story very clearly, and that is a reality. And one could say that, you know, if you do the counterfactual, that perhaps, you know, the strategic picture would have been worse between the two countries had this other reality not existed. That there is some bedrock of kind of understanding, curiosity, sympathy, empathy, you know, that exists, that forms a sort of check and balance. And so my earlier writings, which were quite, you know, strategic, they were strategic arguments for why they cooperated. I mean, probably there may have been another reason for cooperation, which is the kind of direction that you're pointing this conversation in, and I accept that. But I think, you know, the book asked a stark question, which is why they're not friends, and had to answer that question. And in a way, what it says is that the other three P's kind of transcended or trumped the P of perceptions or positive perceptions. I think what is also true, though, is that, you know, I mean, you and I and many others may have had very positive interactions when we've traveled, and likewise Chinese people who've come to India, I'm sure, have had the same. But there's also datum there that shows that it's not all okay. Their perceptions are often racist towards each other. And I try to pull together some of the secondary kind of materials I could lay my hands on. So I had 3 or 4 Indians who've traveled there who point to some episodes and so on. Some of it is ignorance. It's not just all racism that they report. To be fair to these journalists and writers like Vikram Seth and Reshma Patil and so on. But some of it is ignorance. Some of it is just, you know, kind of reflexive racism, or, you know, kind of just a shock almost at each other's different ways, and nothing much more than that. But social media and some forms of commentary do paint a picture where, you know, of perceptions and images that are not nice. And I think one shouldn't ignore those. I mean, I recount, you know, the late 19th century, early 20th century group of Chinese reformers who, worrying about where China, as it sort of fell under the sway of the Europeans looked at India and sort of asked the question, how come this great and proud civilization next to us, from which, you know, we got something as well at some point, how did it, you know, come completely under the sway of colonials? And using, admittedly, British sources and Japanese sources, and the Japanese sources themselves had based, you know, their views on European sources. They came up with an answer which said, you know, which I recount briefly in the book from an article by the sinologist Rudolf Wagner. They said, you know, India fell under the British and wasn't able to get out of colonial rule because India is fatally divided, fatally pluralistic, riven by differences over caste and religion and language and region. they weren't able to mount a united kind of response. They're a fallen people. They don't quite say it, but I mean, there's melancholy in their answer, but there's also, I think, a bit of contempt there. They're messy and noisy, and they just couldn't, we would say in modern parlance, get their act together, riven by all these differences. Woe betide China if it becomes like India. Never become like India was their refrain. And I think something of that has remained, just to cite an example, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, when he was asked in some press conference, and the context matters, it was in America, I think, where he was being asked about the comparison between India and China, and democracy came up. And perhaps he was being assailed about whether India with its democracy, which is one of your poll questions, by the way, might not have a bit of an advantage over China. And he said, well, India is a tribal democracy. Its democracy doesn't really amount to very much. And I mean, it was meant to hurt. It was meant to hurt the questioner, who I don't think was Indian, but it was meant to hurt an Indian self-image as well. And I think, we have counterparts here. All of China is some homogeneous mass. Their leaders are all authoritarian, violent, intolerant, centralizing, and so forth. So I think those perceptions on both sides. During the pandemic, I recount some episodes of the kind of racism in India towards anyone who was supposedly looked Chinese in India, from the northeast of India, or recounted by Indians of Chinese origin or from the northeast. So, I think there is that substructure as well. And Simon Shen and Debashish Chaudhary's work in Hong Kong on social media analysis of contemporary Chinese judgments about India, a lot of them are very, very negative. They haven't done as much on Indian perceptions in the social media, but I think those of us who look at Indian social media will see equally demeaning, caricatured ways of thinking about China. So I think, traditionally, I would agree with you that there is a history of positivity, of sympathy, of empathy, of curiosity. But in modern times, there is also quite a bit of space which is not a positive space. And I think we need to be aware of that. And I think scholarship on the two societies, getting to know each other, is a pushback against that, and is very important.
I think we are seriously out of time, but let me pretend that I'm actually asking the first question in the Q&A session. Sorry, Ravi, and push you in a slightly different direction, and maybe you could think a little bit about that. You can answer it later if you like. I've always been curious about the political impact of certain Chinese ideas, and I don't mean what's China today, but historically, the Chinese communist, the revolution and so on. Certain ideas that have trickled into ordinary politics. I'm not talking about nation state politics now. For example, to this day, we have a very, very long-standing Maoist insurgency, right? Which probably, I don't think there are any real connections to China, but there is a Chinese inspiration and there is still the name. You don't find that mirrored on the Chinese side. But this is something extremely important and never surfaces anywhere in the discussions between Delhi, Beijing, Beijing, Delhi, etc. So I just wondered if what would that tell us about how certain Indians have looked to China for new ideas about Asia, about revolution, about organization, political organization.
Yeah,
so I just want to say that's the first question in the Q&A. So Q&A is also open now.
Okay.
Go ahead, Kanti.
Okay. Yeah, I think that I had some notes I scribbled down as well, where I did make the point about some Indians have drawn inspiration from Maoism philosophically or as a practice, and I guess you can see it in Maoist struggles here in India even now. I would say, I was thinking also, about some of the things that Tagore took to perhaps China, and trying to, and he was received. Even now, I was told until quite recently, some of the best-selling Indian books or books about India are, Tagore's writings. And typically, if they're published, the bookstores that have them, the books are snapped up. So his internationalism, his ideas about a kind of Asian aesthetic, maybe, of cosmopolitanism, his distrust of nationalism, I think there are some of those ideas are in China. I don't think they've disappeared. And there are people who I mean, they may not know it comes from Tagore necessarily, but some do. And I think there's something still alive there. There's an interest in Gandhi and his arguments about nonviolence. I mean, they may not, as Indians do too, they may question other parts of his practice and his philosophy, but I think the idea of nonviolence, nonviolent change, and how his arguments for it and his practice, I mean, I think those have an audience there in China. I think, you know, I was thinking again, you know, about the work of someone like Arunabh Ghosh at Harvard University, who's written about how the Chinese in the 1950s sent over economists and statisticians to learn from Mahalanobis certain kinds of statistical techniques and certain kinds of economic ideas that they took back from India. I mean, that's quite a different sort of set of ideas, very instrumentalist, related to state practice and so on. But Ghosh also has a paper on, you know, on botany and other kinds of scientific learnings that the two had after 1949 from each other. So there's that experience too. And of course, I mean, you know, I don't know if you know Prasenjit Dwara's book as well on kind of his notion of a certain view of Tianxia and this idea of kind of transcendence and the disposition that comes out of that towards nature and the non-human world. And I think his suggestion there, it's a complex book, but as I understand it, he's saying, you know, that there's something Asian there beyond China, beyond India partakes of it in its own way, and as do other Asian countries. So I think there too, I mean, there's been some movement of ideas on both sides, back and forth. Tansen's work, Tansen Sen's work, obviously you would know it from your Hong Kong days, India, China, and the World. I mean, if you want one book that can trace India-China history, and again, I'm just using India-China as a shorthand, going back to antiquity and rolling the story all the way forward to today. I mean, he has so many instances where they learn from and encountered each other. So I think, I mean, I agree with exactly all that. There's that reality and there's that possibility, and it exists. Students, I mean, there's so many Indian students who are not just learning engineering or medicine. I mean, they're learning about China in micro ways. And surely many of them will come back and bring back something, set of ideas to India. One could go on about the learning between the two, I think, and the immersion of the two as well. So I would certainly say that's another book or a set of works to be written by people who could do it. I can't, but...
So just an interim thanks while Ravi tries to invite some questioners on camera. And I will also scroll through the chat box to see if there's anything that we would like to address.
Yes,
Go ahead,
please.
Ravi.
Yeah, please, Tejaswini and Kanti, if any questions catch your attention in the chat, feel free to read them out later. But first, yeah, a few people would like to come on camera and ask their questions directly to you. And just as an aside, on this theme, as you referenced Professor Tansen Sen a moment ago, Tansen was on our webinar a few weeks ago. So anyone in the audience who wants to continue thinking about India-China can go back and watch the recording of that episode. So we've had that. So we have a few people who are keen to come on camera and ask you a few questions and make some comments. But before I do that, since I have the microphone in my hand, can I use my privilege to ask a very small semantics question? Since I bought your book and started reading it, it's been puzzling me on why you decided to call it India versus China rather than India and China. Doesn't that set it up in a confrontational note?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't actually, the publisher did. And they had me by the throat, as they do with authors, I think. Especially not brilliantly well-known ones. And ultimately their marketing people take hold of it. I mean, I must confess, it wasn't my preferred title. And I've said that to them and I've said it publicly. So I'm not saying something behind their backs, but that was not my preferred title. It was closer to what you say, India and China, you know, and then my subtitle was rather different as well. I think these are marketing things. And I mean, if it brought, I guess for me, the saving or the silver lining to that is that if it brought people to it, the book, and the marketing worked, I hope that in actually reading it, they will see that the book is, I mean, it doesn't take sides. I mean, implicitly reading between the lines, you might feel that sometimes I take more the Indian view and sometimes I take more the Chinese view on a certain episode or matter. But I tried to avoid that. I think temperamentally, that's not me in any case, to be so polarizing in my views. But so the book is written, I hope, and I think very even-handedly in that sense. I think that's closer to the truth of the relationship, even when it's been bad. And so, yeah, if that provocative title brought people in and then they read it and got something different, if it actually got them out of a very negative view, then I think the book would have done its job despite the title, and or maybe because of the title, it pulled people in who thought the worst but came away with a more balanced view.
Yeah, it did that for me on a sample size of 1. I can say that I started the book assuming that it will be confrontational, but I ended it on as looking at it in much more cooperation rather than confrontation. So that was good. Okay, so there are many people who have questions. We can start with Shikha. Shikha, you are there. Shikha is a student at in our MBA program. She has a question for you. Shikha, you can unmute yourself and come and ask your question.
Yes, sir. Good evening. So I would like to ask you that what can be certain steps by India in terms of trade or otherwise for betterment of relations with China or even for global unity for that matter?
Yeah, thanks. That's a very big question. I think one of the difficulties, I mean, the book doesn't make any big prescriptions or recommendations for what the two sides should do. I mean, their diplomats are very clever people, and I'm sure they have all kinds of ideas. Actually, if you look at the history since 1949, they have done pretty much everything it's possible to do. I mean, in the various ways of solving conflict. I mean, you mentioned trade. So there's a standard liberal argument that if two countries trade a lot, invest in each other, then they become interdependent. And then the costs of going to war or perpetuating a conflict are much too high. And you move, even if you don't love the other country and its people and its society, you gradually move towards accommodative sort of arrangements. You solve your conflicts and you avoid war. But of course, I mean, you could say that to some extent that maybe that's the evidence shows that's true, which is to say, I mean, over the last 10, 20 years, India-China trade has boomed. It's at about 70 or 80 billion annually. And that's quite a chunk of trade. And maybe that's what's prevented the relationship getting worse. Again, it's one of these what ifs of history are counterfactual. But it hasn't altogether solved the quarrel either. We haven't got an agreement on the border. We haven't disengaged forces in strength from certain areas. We don't always look in kindly eyes towards third area problems, let us say, Pakistan's role or our relative position in the Indian Ocean and our warships plying those oceans and possibly confronting each other and so on. So that way of solving the problem has kind of been tried. In 1988, when Rajiv Gandhi went to Beijing, he overturned a well-known Indian position, which was we will have no truck with China, no normalization until the border issue is kind of solved, until China moves all its troops out of and gives us what we want on the border. But in 88, he went there and he said, no, let's normalize. Let's have trade, people to people, cultural exchange, sporting exchange, and negotiate the border at the same time. And the two would, kind of play off each other. So we've tried that also, not just trade, but a larger process of normalization, hoping that the spillover from that would soften up our view of the border problem. And again, one could say that it has, to some extent, had that impact and may have avoided a much worse quarrel, but it hasn't led to a final settlement of the border and perhaps other kinds of cooperative outcomes that we may have wished for. So there was that way of solving conflict that's been tried. Then we've tried, kind of much less ambitious stuff, which is confidence building measures, which is just a fancy word for saying that let's have a certain degree of transparency on what we can do militarily and not do militarily up in the borderlands. So there are no misunderstandings. So if you move your troops too close, that's now kind of forbidden. If your patrols are very heavily armed, we agreed not to do that. We agreed not to carry out military exercises in strength near the borderlands, again, so that we don't have any misunderstandings between us, etc., etc. So most of those have been honored, not all of them all the time, but that didn't work either, as we saw Galwan blow up in our face, and there've been confrontations in 2013, 14, 15, 17, prior to Galwan that nearly got militarized as well. So, if you think that just dealing with the day-to-day issues of military stability will somehow create the conditions where you won't worry each other, and then that creates the space for a settlement and a better relationship, it didn't quite do that either. And then we tried symmetry on the argument that, the top leadership should really know each other. Because even after 1988, the two leaderships hardly ever met each other face to face. But by the end of the Cold War and by the early 2000s, not just our two premiers, the two presidents, the foreign ministers, they were meeting each other 20, 30 times a year. With the idea that, a kind of social capital would be built up between the highest level leaderships. Modi had 2 informal summits, just before Galwan, 2-3 years earlier, and several other summits before that. But we still got into a fracas. So I think, I don't know, there's a whole menu of things that diplomats and countries try vis-a-vis each other to try and solve the problem, but it hasn't quite worked. And I must say, if you say, what should we do? I would also at this point slightly throw my hands up. But one of the things I conclude is that, a bit provocatively, is that the power gap now is so big that something around power is important, and because I think there's a bit of a view in China that amongst the leadership that China is so big now compared to India that it doesn't quite see why it should accommodate India on things like the border. And then conversely, on the Indian side, out of our weakness, there's a feeling that we can't make accommodations either, because to do so would be regarded as strategic surrender and appeasement. And which leadership or, which elite in India would want to do that or be seen to do that either? So that power asymmetry has become a problem in itself, logically, if that's part of the problem, then you sort of think, well, maybe some bridging of this power gap is important. In itself, in any case, India's economic growth, a better life for its people, and all that is important. But it may also have the effect that if the economic gap with the Chinese closes, that there may be a sense of, maybe we can now solve this issue without these encumbrances of, I will look weak, why do I have to accommodate such a weak country, etc. Maybe those can be pushed away, and from a position of relative symmetry, they can fashion a solution. But I'm afraid that's all I have to offer at the moment.
Thank you, Shikha. Thank you, Kante, for such a comprehensive and balanced response to that question from Shikha. We have some interesting questions from Ritusha Tiwari, Professor Ritusha Tiwari. If you're there, you would like to come on camera and ask your question.
Hi, thanks. Thank you for that provocative take. And I'm currently reading your book, Professor Vajpayee, and I hope to come up with some informed opinions about the topic. My question primarily is, as you mentioned earlier in response to one of the questions, how much of the contemporary relations of India and China are guided by ideology, And if you don't feel that currently ideology has any stakes in how the contours of these relationships are guided, then when do you think the kind of semi-ideological parity and third world solidarity, which you were mentioning earlier, slided into the stark notions of territoriality and aggressive nationalism? And related to that, I would like to know your take on the nature of India-China border dispute. Does it in any way represent a totally dehumanized entity in state politics, which is totally immune to, devastating impacts of the global pandemic that we saw? I mean, the way it erupted, why did it erupt, and how does it inform us about the nature of the border that the two share? Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's probably, arguments about kind of ideological formations are very complex, and I'm not a political philosopher primarily, but it does seem to me that something around the ideology of the nation state is very, very strong. I mean, one could say that having a nation state itself is an ideological position. We know from Benedict Anderson and so on that it's a kind of cultural construct and imagined community and all of that. But also it seems to me that it's solidified into something like an ideological position. And certainly in my discipline, international relations, there's a sense that from critical perspectives that the international system that we take for granted, a so-called Westphalian world, where states are all imagined as sovereign with their rights and obligations, and that is a kind of a very deeply conservative ideological view of the world, where people are trapped into these tight formations called nation states. And we've all agreed tacitly, in these nation states that nobody can leave them. I mean, one of the most conservative things about the international system is that you can't secede. How many secessions have occurred in, let's say after World War II? Very, very few. Bangladesh was one, and you have a few in Central Europe after the Cold War, one or two in Africa. Of course, in a sense, Singapore seceded or was kicked out of the Malaysian Federation. I mean, but out of 200 nation states that exist, very few are willing to countenance anyone seceding and leaving. However strong the moral argument may be, on that issue, everyone bands together. And so I think there's a very deep ideological formation around the nation state. And some see it as a very positive ideological attachment, because nation states give you something as well. They promise you law and order and perhaps identity of a kind, and keep you safe, and or maybe also the grounds for things like, a planning, delivering, provisioning state. I mean, if you don't have nation states, can you really have governments that can plan for the future, provision all kinds of things that we associate with progressive social policy? So I think there's that sort of very positive ideology of the nation state, and then there's the critical attack on it, which is that nation states are suffocating. They're often and almost always represent a kind of violence on people and their choices as well. So I think there is a huge ideological tussle, and India and China are trapped in that. I mean, I was saying earlier that there's a political culture issue there, where India broadly, at least up to a point, took a very forensic, legalistic view, even in its domestic politics. I think there was a lot of that, and insistence on it, even if it wasn't always the reality. But I think that's given way in India increasingly. I'm not so sure that that kind of liberal attachment to how institutions work under a constitutional structure, with the courts and kind of legal forensic ways of solving problems and dealing with them, that's undergone a change. And so, and on the Chinese side, in a way, from the communist perspective, legalism, forensic constitutional ways were always a bit of a maya. I mean, they were the opium of the masses. they were what allowed the elites and the bourgeoisie to have their way. You pretend you're doing stuff constitutionally and so on, but actually this is just a device for the elite and ruling class to have their way. And so, Nehru and Indian liberalism championed that, and then I think on the Chinese side, they had a very different view of what is politics and legitimate politics. So I think what they both partake of an ideology, which is the supremacy now of the nation state. And that unites them at one level, but it really means that the border problem gets frozen. I mean, it's the only way they can kind of seemingly look at the border problem is from that perspective. They can't accept fuzzy liminal areas at the edges of their, at the territorial limits of their societies, which was probably historically the case, that those areas were always fuzzy. There was no very carefully delineated border between them. And they did all right by it for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. But then this nation state ideology has come along and they both partake of it, and it's divided them fatally. And at the same time, then there's at another level, there's this ideological divide of, kind of something still like liberal proceduralism on the Indian side, and on the Chinese side of a different kind of proceduralism, perhaps democratic centralism, if you want to call it that. And so, yeah, they're divided by that too, it seems to me.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Our philosopher is in the house. So Musa, you have a question, it seems. Yep, Musa.
Thank you so much, Ravi. Yeah, thank you, Kanti. It was a very wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. Actually, it's a kind of two questions. The first one, actually, you mentioned thinking counterfactually. And you also mentioned that, many different ways has been tried by, the two countries in order to see whether they can come to a closer cooperative situation. Now, I was thinking that, if you think counterfactually, what were the two countries would be if they hadn't gone those, steps? Maybe those steps actually that you mentioned apparently didn't work. They worked, and that's why actually we are, that's why India is not in war in China. The second question that I wanted to ask actually is about the forming alliance, because you mentioned that China has never entered into an alliance against India, but India has entered to many alliances in a confrontational way to China. So very recently, I think just last week, it seems that the US administration is trying to form a new alliance between India, Japan, and Australia to kind of, confine China in some sense. How productive would that be, do you think, for India-China relation? Does it help the balance of power, or you think that would be counterproductive in bringing a more peaceful cooperation?
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Musa, for that. I think the first one, if I understood it properly, you seem to be suggesting that, the various cooperative acts that they tried, in a sense, I mean, they became victims of their own success. That the cooperation took them up to a point, and maybe to some extent made them complacent, thinking that they'd done enough, as it were, to stabilize the relationship and soften it up to the point where, as two governments, they could then solve it. But that moment of solving it actually never came, partly because they patted themselves on the back so much about how well they dealt with the issue over the last 30, 40 years. So it may be that the cooperativeness of a certain kind, I mean, it was too limited, perhaps. It was self-encapsulating. It didn't allow them to be more ambitious about their cooperation. I mean, we can see 40 years of border talks, but, after a while, we're not privy, obviously, to everything that happened at the negotiating table. But what we can see is that after a while, it just became very mechanical, and they said the same things to each other at every single meeting. It was like they just ticked the box. The meeting is mandated. We have done the meeting. We can now tell our populations that in all good faith, we hold the meetings regularly and we're trying desperately to solve the problem, but actually they were doing nothing. There was no progress being made after a point. Yeah, so I think, you know, before this talk began, I was walking up and down my apartment thinking almost exactly perhaps the point that you were making, which is that maybe the cooperation became a limiting factor itself because it wasn't ambitious enough. And then political change in both countries have taken them in a way that they don't want to do a very much more ambitious stuff. China is on a bit of a high about its, you know, very important position now in the world, and Xi Jinping's, you know, China dream and so on is to be a kind of number one, and it's imagining the world in all kinds of other ways. And this India-China thing is perhaps maybe not so important, even though we had the fracas. But on the Indian side, you know, with the rise of conservatism, Hindu nationalism, there's perhaps a different view here of what's important. It became more important to deal with and remake Indian society and Indian cultural politics and do social engineering here. And in that endeavor, you know, it wasn't possible to think much more ambitiously about the relationship with China. Indeed, China became imbricated in that kind of social engineering. India that would stand up, you know, and so forth. No longer the old India of, you know, fuzzy Chacha Nehru, who was kind of at best well-meaning, but, you know, he was not. That's a kind of accusation that I think now is commonplace almost, and not just in the hands of Hindu nationalists and so on. It's like, oh, he was kind of out of his depth, you know, and he was a well-meaning guy, but he didn't really know what he was up to. And now we've transitioned to something much more cold-eyed in India, apparently. We can now really face up to reality. And so that's the new India. And in that politics of we must face up to everything cold-eyed in India, then maybe you can't be much more ambitious. Looking cold-eyed towards China too means that is what the nature of the game now is. So I think there's a kind of social psychology on both sides that has occurred. The cooperativeness became self-encapsulating. Political change internally have taken the two countries in a different direction. And a moment where they may have looked at each other in a more kindly eye and done something very ambitious. And there were moments, you know, when that could have happened. The Chinese and Indians both saying during Manmohan's time and even Vajpayee's time, there's enough space in the world for both of us to grow was kind of the locution that they both used. I mean, no way they speak that language today under Xi Jinping and Modi. So, you know, I think you're right that, I mean, the counterfactual tells you something. I mean, counterfactuals have that quality, is that they're unanswerable at some level, but they kind of prompt you to think about historical possibilities and why we couldn't go in that direction. And one can do it more rigorously and less rigorously. And I think that kind of work needs to be done.
Thank you so much, Musa. Thank you, Kanti. Okay, so we are...
Just a word on the partnerships. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the Quad and the free and open Indo-Pacific, and that is India, Japan, the United States, and Australia together. And that idea goes back some years now. It's been reinvigorated. They just had a Quad meeting in Washington. I mean, the elephant in the room is China there. And they're not calling out China, but everyone knows it's an anti-China alliance. So, yeah, I mean, you know, balance of power has its own importance. You've got to play that game too, I would say. As Nehru said, of course, balances of power occasionally break down, and then you have war. So it's an odd thing. I mean, but at some level, you've also got to play the balance of power game so that states come to a point where they say, okay, well, maybe we've got to now make sure that we go beyond the balance of power and try and solve a few things too. But at a moment, you have to play balance of power. Just as I think in our personal relationships, sometimes one has to stand firm against someone who is, you know, an antagonist or rival in the workplace or elsewhere. So if that's true at the personal and micro level, it's also true in the game of nation states. So, I mean, I wouldn't altogether badmouth balance of power.
Yeah, just a remark on that, Kanti and Musa, not only Quad, but in the rush to form anti-China partnerships, countries seem to be kind of shooting themselves in the foot. Well, again, last week with the UK and US going into a deal with Australia for those nuclear-powered submarines, they ended up putting France's nose out of place, and France is angry with US and UK now. So everyone is trying to go anti-China, but in the as a result, ending up displeasing each other as well, not just China.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Okay, so we are out of the time that we had booked both Kanti and Tejaswini you for. So there are a few more questions in the chat box. But I understand, Tejaswini, you need to leave now. And Kanti, you also.
I'm fine. Yes.
So, Tejaswini, you need to leave now, right? Yeah.
Yes, but I don't want to be impolite. I need
No,
to go somewhere else.
so what we can do, Tejaswini, if this is okay with you, because there are 2 or 3 very interesting questions. So from your point of view, if there are any closing remarks you want to say, and then you will be excused, and then we can carry on with Kanti for another 10 minutes. Is okay, Kanti?
Sure.
For taking up 2 or 3 more questions. Yeah. So Tejaswini, you want any?
No, absolutely no closing remarks. I think Kanti has helped us to open a discussion, which I'm sure will continue on other forums and maybe when he comes back in person, etc. So absolutely, there's no closure to this discussion. And it's an ongoing problem, as Musa pointed out, there are developments every single day. So I think that this has put some issues in perspective, opened up other new questions, and I'm sure in different ways, even the work of my center will take forward some of the discussions. So thank you all for all the people who came, all the people who asked questions. I noticed there are very interesting questions, but I had committed to going somewhere else. So pleasure to see you again, Kanti, and thank you, Ravi, for thinking of me.
Thank you, Tejaswini. And as you said, we will continue this discussion and we will fulfill Kanti's long-standing desire to get him to Ahmedabad physically. He missed it last time, so we'll get him here, sure.
All right.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
thank you, Tejaswini. Kanti, we will open the floor for 1 or 2 more questions. I believe Shaurya Patel, you had a question. Would you want to ask that now?
Yeah, so I have basically 2 questions. Do you think since India was a former colony, therefore by default our relationship integrated towards the Western world, with hyper globalization have influenced the current aggressive foreign policy towards China? That's the first question. And the second question is, do you think the shift from dirigism to market-based approach in India changed our relationship with China?
Yeah, I mean, just on the first question, I think we have to be a bit careful. I wouldn't say that everything that India does has been aggressive towards China. It's responded sometimes to what it's seen as aggression as well. And there are elements, that I rehearsed: the trade and the confidence-building measures, the meeting of leaders at the highest level, and and so on, border talks. I mean, those are not elements of aggression. I mean, they were intended to try and soften up the relationship and manage it. And those still exist, by the way. I mean, they're still happening, even when things are not so happy. Certainly, you can see broadly that since about the 2000s, early 2000s, India has tended towards, an alliance-like disposition towards China because of its weakness, because the economic gap has become so enormous. I mean, in 1980, they were more or less at parity. Today's China's GDP is 5 times India's size. Its per capita income is 4 times India's size. And the absolute difference is likely to grow. It's not going to reduce anytime soon. On the base that China has of $14 trillion and counting, even if it grows at 5 or 6%, that's a huge increment to its GDP. India on 2.78 trillion, even if it grows faster than China, the increments are going to be relatively small. So the absolute difference is going to be enormous. The gap of $11 trillion today might become $20 trillion gap in GDP terms in 20 years or less. So, you know, this difference is enormous. And you can see how, as a result of that, India has just had to move, despite a kind of almost civilizational reluctance to, you know, do alliances, because India does not like to be kind of a secondary to anyone. You know, you could see that it's willy-nilly over the last 50, 60 years, and more so since 2000, really had to get in good with particularly the United States. Now, if you say that's aggressive towards China, I mean, I would accept that. But it's come out of weakness and a perception of weakness and a very weak bargaining hand. Since there's no prospect of the kind of reforms internally that could really close the gap very quickly, then it doesn't seem to be any great strategic choice except to go towards the Americans. So the very ambitious internal reforms, and by that I mean not just, oh, let's improve ease of doing business or carry out some tax reform or employment reform or labor reform or land reform. I mean, kind of a thoroughgoing emancipation of Indian society, of freeing up the talents and the energies of people from the shackles of caste and all kinds of other ways in which they are kept down in India. I mean, whatever we might say, China has managed that. Out of civil war, out of war and revolution, it lost many people as well, as Amartya Sen pointed out, in the famines, but the huge mass of Chinese people were emancipated in a way that's, you know, unprecedented. But India has not had that moment, you know, partly, you know, many of these emancipations have come out of, sad to say, but out of warfare, out of total war in the modern period, from the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic period onwards. Citizens have been given freedoms and social provisionings have been advanced and reforms have taken place, you know, because of strategic competition. You know, Charles Tilley, the famous sociologist, said, war makes the state and the state makes war, and war makes the state. You know, the strategic competition between states caused elites to emancipate large chunks of their people, maybe not fully, but over time in all kinds of ways. But India hasn't undergone that, it seems to me. And so when I'm talking about a thoroughgoing reform of India to kind of, you know, it's not tinkering with these small reforms that the government touts now and then. It's a thoroughgoing emancipation, including an emancipation from looking at nature in a particular way. I mean, when China made its astonishing rise, it was at a time when we didn't care that much about the environment, when it was a fully globalized world, goods, but the world has changed, and India is hitting a time when that's not plausible anymore. And internal reform to free up the energy of its people and to give them a good life, and to do it all at a time in the world when there's planetary change due to climate change, enormous kind of challenge before India, it seems to me. So I think that, you know, the kind of moment we're in, I mean, go back to your question about globalization and all of that. I think India hasn't been very aggressive, but to the extent that it's gone more aggressive, it's out of its weakness. And of course, internal political change that I was talking about earlier, towards a more conservative political life. And so those are, that's meant a certain kind of disposition towards China. I mean, and on the Chinese side, as I said, there have been changes as well, which are not helpful. So, yeah, I mean, I think that globalization let loose a certain kind of imagination of economic progress and, you know, and all of that, but it didn't lead to a very fundamental change in India towards kind of a freeing up of the vast mass of deprived human beings in our country. And if that had happened, perhaps we would have been in a better place on foreign policy, India-China relations, and all of that. I know these are rather tenuous connections between kind of social policy, politics internally, the imperatives and opportunities in international politics. But I think one has to kind of try and fit all these pieces together to understand why things have gone between India and China the way they've gone, and why India has gone down a certain road towards China in the last 10 or 15 years. I mean, it's not all India's fault, but there's a deeper set of problems brewing and forces that have been unleashed that make for it.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Shaurya, and thanks, Kanti. One last question, and then Kanti will release you to go for, I guess it's dinner time for you in Singapore, so we'll let you go for your dinner. One last question. Praveen had a very interesting question. Praveen Tripathi, you're there? Want to ask your question?
He may have left.
No, I'm here. I'm very much.
Yeah, Praveen. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, this is more, from a personal observation. I have worked in China for a year, and I found that the Chinese, have an implicit respect for Westerners, right? Any white skin. However, they have very little respect for Indians as professionals. So they are very happy to report to a Westerner, without any compunction, but they report to an Indian grudgingly. And, it took quite some time, appreciation from a Scottish client, etc., for them to really begin to accept me even on par. But the default state is that a Westerner, I did replace an American, in that job. The default state is that a Westerner, implicitly wins their respect.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in the perceptions chapter, sorry, were you still?
No. So I was just asking, what explains this differential perception?
Well, I mean, I think the short answer is that, power does. You look up to power, and the Westerners had the power for a long time. And like the rest of the world, the Chinese imbibed a view that the Westerners were special. They couldn't have become so powerful otherwise. That lingers. I mean, it's dual-faced, like in the rest of the world. We all look up to Westerners, frankly. I mean, it's not just the Chinese. And we make many exceptions for them and allowances for them and indulgences towards them because of the power. And at the same time, we resent them and dislike them and sometimes hate them, and that's true in China as well, I think. Hate is a strong word, but I mean, I think there is that element in the world out there towards Westerners. And so India and China, I mean, share that. In Manjari Miller's very interesting book, Wronged by Empire, she shows that, argues that both India and China have a feeling of victimhood coming out of their exposure to the West. But part of that is looking up to the West, part of that is disliking them. I mean, so I think India, the corollary of that is that they really don't look up to anybody else. I mean, they sort of looked up to, I think, the Chinese to Japan for a while. But now with their own growing power and standing in the world, they probably don't look up to Japan that much, as much as they used to. But India, as I was saying in this perceptions chapter, the subtitle to that chapter is From Respect to Disdain. And I think that's been true on both sides. Very crudely, one could say that out of Buddhism, there was a Chinese view, not all Chinese, but a Chinese view that India was the Middle Kingdom. I mean, they literally used the word Chongwo, the Middle Kingdom, for India because of its Buddhism, or some did. But by 1000 of the Christian era, more or less, Buddhism was gone in India as a major force. And the links to India and that kind of feeling of respect and engagement over Buddhism, I mean, no longer operated. And then there was a period, you could say, in the 14th century, 15th century, when select Indian kingdoms in the Malabar, in Bengal, sent tribute to the Chinese court. So there was respect from some Indian kingdoms up to the Chinese imperial court. Again, a time of respect. But with the coming of the Europeans, that link between the two societies, I think, degraded further, it seems to me. And the story I was recounting earlier of these Chinese reformer intellectuals who, trying to meditate on India and what happened to it, drew very negative views of India. And of course, their experience with Indian policemen that the British brought in, Indian soldiers who the British brought in. They had complaints also about Indian traders, sometimes linked to the opium trade and so on in the 19th century. They saw them as unscrupulous and so forth. So, you have a kind of a whole series of things that occurred that on the Chinese side that took them towards a view of disdain towards India, it seems to me. And some of that has remained. And I think I agree with Tejaswini that at the personal level, walking around the streets of Shanghai or Xi'an or other places, people like you and me and others are not going to be accosted. And not all Chinese are racist, not all Indians are racist, but there is an undercurrent also of looking down on India. And this kind of, I excerpted a number of pages of Reshma Patil's book, where she was a correspondent in China for 3 years. And she recounts so many stories of exactly the kind that you mentioned, of Chinese reporters sitting in a hall where Indian businessmen are trying to talk about all their wares and everyone is asleep. No one's paying attention. They were sent there, they have to cover it, but there's no respect for what's being said there. There's ignorance. Some interlocutors that she would meet would say, where is India? Is it next to Africa? I mean, they couldn't even locate India on the map, And then there's this kind of view of India's chaos, it's a land of chaos. Nothing works. And to be fair, we ourselves have that image of our country often, or an image like that. The bureaucracy doesn't work, the politicians argue, we're divided by caste and religion, and we can't get our act together. Well, the Chinese also have that view, so do other foreigners. And so I think there is an undercurrent of that view amongst Chinese people there. And one interesting response I have had from Jabin Jacob, who's an academic at Shivnada University who specializes in China. He said, Kanti, I can see what you're saying, but it's also being used, that image is being propagated and pushed out by the Chinese government to further this notion that, India can never match us. And he thinks that there's an anxiety there actually on the Chinese side, that actually India might get its act together one day. And with this demographic change, India is going to be 1.6 billion people in 30 years from now. China will have gone down to less than 1.2 billion. There'll be a population gap of 400 million people. That there's an anxiety perhaps there, not just about the demography, but about something about kind of the resilience perhaps of India, or its democracy, or its ability to maybe be a technological power someday. And so, this view of India is not an accidental one, just a precipitate of history, but it's being subtly encouraged by Chinese elites, political elites. I don't know enough to say, but I mean, I think that may be plausible. Wang Yi saying, India is a tribal democracy. So I mean, I can see what you're saying, and I think there is that reality, and we have to be aware of it. At a personal level, there's very seldom a problem with a Chinese person and an Indian person meeting. Just as when Indians and Pakistanis meet in a room outside of strategic issues, we share so much, but it doesn't solve the bilateral quarrel. And we would be romanticizing it if we thought that just because we can share a meal together and drink wine together and sing songs together, that it will solve that problem. Because there is a substratum also of, strategic issues have their own logic, and then cultural life is differentiated. There are people who are very open-minded, and there are people who are disrespectful towards the other side.
Thank you.
Thank you, Praveen. Thank you, Kanti. I think we'll need to close here and let Kanti go. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks for staying on much longer than we had engaged you for. And thanks to the audience for joining in and for staying on. So we'll let Kanti go to his dinner, and we'll let the audience go and watch their IPL match now. Thank you so many of you who've given up on your IPL to come for this talk. Good night, everyone, and we'll see you soon with another episode of the conversation series. And Kanti, we'll find a way to get you to Ahmedabad.
Thanks. Look forward to it. Thanks very much for doing this and for your patience and listening to me.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Bye.